Hi. Cool. So I'm here today to talk about design, obviously, and branding. And more specifically, the difference between design as a medium for communication, which we're finding now can really be automated, and design as a vehicle for innovation, which we believe is where our value as designers really lies. I'm Sophie. I am the head of design at Mythology, and I came to design a little bit circuitously through art history and fashion. So I've always approached design with a little bit of a wider aperture than just straight up graphic design. Mythology is known for the brands that we build, and agencies are often known for like a specific aesthetic, or they have certain tropes, but we're not known for a certain aesthetic. We really try to differentiate the projects as much as humanly possible. And this is actually a studio project that we developed, which is sort of an encapsulation of how we work. We took all the rounds of all the creative for all of the brand projects that we had done for 5 years and sort of remixed it into this over 500-page publication that sort of sought to interrogate like all of that work that typically goes into the trash, and just sort of zoom out and look at brand building a little bit more from an artist's lens. Talking about branding is interesting because design tools are really becoming open source. And we're finding that the question kind of becomes, how do we go about making design that really does actually innovate as opposed to just simply communicating the thing? And we find that tension is kind of the most important thing when we're thinking about how we can innovate. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So if we zoom out a little bit, I just want to acknowledge that historically, this idea of tension has been explored in fields outside of design and branding for a really long time. In photography, this idea is really well known. It refers to this kind of rupture or question mark that's in an image. Roland Barthes, the famous critical theorist, defined this idea as punctum in his book Camera Lucida. He says, "It is the element which rises from the scene, shoots out of it like an arrow, and pierces me. It's a sting, a speck, a cut, a little hole, a cast of the dice. A photograph's punctum is that accident which pricks me." And that's also interesting when we think about like internet and meme culture, because what makes something meme-worthy is that kind of tension, that punctum, that thing that sticks out at you, that's sort of incongruous and pricks at the viewer. Of course, in art history and in decorative arts, there are many versions of this idea of tension. In Japanese culture, there's wabi-sabi, which is the idea of beauty and imperfection. So instead of something being totally resolved, that imperfection or that organic quality is what makes it really interesting. Asymmetry in fine art. These are all sort of examples that I pulled together that sort of illustrate that. And in design, which is mostly on the right here, just pulled together some examples of tension that feel really iconic. Designers like Tibor Kalman, who I'm sure most people in this room know, his firm M&Co was like iconic for creating design that sort of encapsulated this idea of tension. He operated more like an artist and really believed that design had to do a lot more than people were used to. His work for United Colors of Benetton and Café Florent really subverted norms. This idea of like play between word and image and how image could subvert words and words could subvert image was very iconic to his work. And all of these things really sacrifice pure communication for innovation because they have this tension, this weird thing, this incongruous element. Another example up here, Comme des Garçons, famously is an anti-fashion brand, which sort of made them the blueprint for cool. I love this quote from Rei Kawakubo, who's the founder of CDG. She said, "For something to be beautiful, it doesn't have to be pretty." And I love thinking about that notion, particularly with fashion, because it is so much about beauty. But her interpretation of that idea is what made Comme des Garçons like as I mentioned, this blueprint for cool, this idea that, becoming anti-fashion became this pervasive idea that led the industry, that now, like, the coolest brands are sort of anti-fashion brands, that sort of just like have design being more art-led became the thing to do in design. And I guess the point here is that even though brands are not art per se, or that graphic design's long-standing debate of whether it's art or not, they should provoke these similarly engaging reactions in people that like great photography and fashion do. And I think, this whole discussion around AI that I mentioned with design for communication, it's interesting because it is becoming automated. If you can describe something in words, you can make it now. You can signal that a beauty brand is a beauty brand without doing any design work per se. But it doesn't produce an emotional connection or a special feeling. It's just this weird sinkhole of Pinterest, sea of sameness images. And that's because AI is inherently familiar. It is basically just inputting all these rules and standards from the internet and spitting back out this mirror, this sea of sameness, which is what we're trying to always push against in design, is to like break through that sea of sameness. And so it's interesting that we're sort of landing here. And so when we actually look to make something interesting, this is kind of an interesting example of that. Half Magic is a beauty brand that we built, and it was born out of the show Euphoria, and its makeup artist, Donnie Davies' artistry. So it was a unique challenge, like how could we take this lush, filmic, editorial world and translate that into a brand that could really break through a crowded market? There's a new beauty brand like every 10 minutes, and it's a very samey market with a lot of samey brands, and a lot of work that kind of looks like that weird AI K-hole that we just came out of. So what was the tension was sort of the question that we had to ask ourselves, and we had this insight that, the makeup was not about this idea of heteronormative glamour and perfection. It could be a vehicle for transformation and operate more like an art practice than a traditional beauty brand. And so from that insight that the brand was about transformation and art making, we knew that there was this innate tension between the maximalism of the show and the minimalism of like art making supplies that we could kind of extrapolate and tease out into a really interesting brand. So this is actually a mood board from one of the first presentations that we gave to A24, where we tried to really crystallize that idea. And we knew early on that we didn't want to simply communicate that it was just a beauty brand, because the brand itself is not just about beauty. And the show was so innovative and groundbreaking and looked so good that the brand had this really high bar that we had to meet. So that was intimidating, but also a great challenge. So, in the beginning, you really try to seed this very relevant, like sticky idea that gives you this good jumping off point, and that feels really substantial, so that you have a lot to work with when you're trying to tease out this tension and make something innovative as opposed to just communicative. So from that initial idea and, in our process, there is this huge iterative undertaking where you're really ideating from that initial core idea. And you're sort of creating and generating a bunch of design and at the same time editing down to the final thing. And all the while you're trying to implement taste and humanity, which, as I mentioned, when we're trying to distinguish between just communication and innovation, humanity and taste are kind of the X factors, and we feel like that's where our value increasingly lies as designers when, the tools for automation are getting sharper and smarter all the time. So it never made sense for us to go about building this brand using these industry standards, like that AI sort of industry standard stuff we were looking at, because the show really defied industry standards in and of itself, and then the brand would just sort of look like everything else. So we really tried to tease out that tension between maximalism and minimalism by, obviously creating this lush visual world, but also finding the symbolism that we could turn into like the brand mark. And we landed around this really beautiful diamond that was iconic of Donnie's artistry, because all of the sort of shimmer and shine and glimmer that's iconic to her in the show was sort of crystallized in that really simple mark. And so, we went through that whole journey, and all the while we're trying to continue to move away from this samey brand landscape where everything feels really uninspired and, is just meeting the bar of communication, and sort of trying to push way past that to innovate. So Sake Ono is another project that we did where we wanted to draw upon the heritage of Japanese design, but avoid being pastiche or using these kind of tropes that communicate Japan or sake. The vines, we were inspired by the vernacular design of ancient Europe, but wanted to leave things really imperfect and kind of raw, like the terroir. With Casa Bonita, which is actually owned by the South Park guys, we leaned way into 1970s Americana and let the food speak for itself. With House Labs, which is Gaga's brand, instead of pretty beauty light and portraiture, we used filters and exaggerated lenses to create this world for the brand that felt like an extension of Gaga, which was an experience. With Agua Mágica, we made everything feel really of the earth and organic and filmic and textural, and differentiate in, again, another really crowded market that's usually, again, pretty pastiche. And with Staple Gin, we wanted to defy a category that's typically very clean and blue and clear and sort of English, and again, pastiche and pretty vernacular, with a dark, completely illustrative package. So at our studio, we're always really hoping to attract projects that are up for this challenge of doing something different. So not wanting to just communicate the thing, but to really break the mold and innovate and challenge the sea of sameness. And we really hope that we can continue to reinforce the value that humanity and the role of innovation plays in design, as the world around us is becoming more and more automated, and the role of designers continuing to get interrogated. So, thank you.